Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. I'm Dan Freeman with American Libraries Live. We are glad to have you here for today's episode, Going Beyond Google. We are really very excited about today's discussion. Before we start, I just want to thank OCLC for sponsoring today's episode. OCLC is a worldwide library cooperative owned, governed, and sustained by members since 1967. Its public purpose is a statement of commitment to each other that we will work together to improve access to the information held in libraries around the globe and find ways to reduce costs for libraries through collaboration. So we're very grateful to OCLC for sponsoring. We also want to thank the library here at Northwestern University for providing space and equipment that allows us to run these broadcasts. I want to welcome our fantastic panel today. Let me start by welcoming Joanna Burkhart. Joanna, good to have you here. Joanna is a professor and head librarian at the University of Rhode Island branch libraries in Providence and Narragansett, which I think I just pronounced correctly. Did I get that right, Joanna?
You got it right.
All right. Let me welcome Nikki Krisak, which I also hope I pronounced correctly. Nikki is the head of instructional services at Norwich University in Vermont. Welcome, Nikki.
Thank you.
And I want to welcome John McCullough. He's the product manager for Discovery at OCLC. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
And finally, I want to welcome Beth McDonough, and Beth is the Research and Instruction Librarian at Western Carolina University. Welcome, Beth.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, so I know the title for our episode is Going Beyond Google. Maybe that's slightly misleading because we are going to be going beyond Google, but we're going to be talking about Google itself as well. So we're going to go beyond Google, but we'll also stay within Google a little bit. I want to start just by bringing up an issue that I know probably every single person in the audience has heard about, and that is that librarians, we know that budgets are being cut. We know that this is a tough time for many libraries. We're constantly hearing this message from people. We've got Google. We've got all these search engines and free sources of information, so we don't really need libraries anymore. So I want to just start by doing sort of a round robin and asking everybody who's with us today, everybody on our panel, if someone were to say that to you, what's your elevator speech? What's your quick response, your quick way to debunk that comment? So Joanna, why don't we start with you?
Well, my quick comment is that if you want to drink from a fire hose, Google is just fine. But if you want more limited and accurate information, you need a better way to do that. There's so much information, and it's piled up in a huge mountain of stuff. And in order to find exactly what you're looking for, I think libraries are a better way to go.
Okay, I think that's a really good elevator speech. Beth, how about yours?
Oh, well, when I get that question, I instantly know that whoever's asking it hasn't been in a library any time recently. I would challenge them to actually visit a library and explore, because we're so much more than just a flow of information in terms of especially being an informal learning space that's user-driven and helps give that information context and a human touch.
And John, how about you?
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be that to remind folks that libraries are the end point of a user search, even if that user search starts at Google. So it's first and foremost not an either-or. There's no reason someone starting a search at Google can't end up at the library using those resources. So I'd probably argue that it's a false dichotomy. And the analogy I'd use is the way people, myself included, currently use Google to find, for example, movie times. I don't go to an individual library or individual movie theater and search them anymore. I just search Google. It provides me with those movie times, but I still go to the local cinema, and that's where I actually consume the film. And I think the analogy holds up for libraries. Even in a future where the searching happens out on Google, Google can't provide the fulfillment that the library provides.
Okay. And Nikki, last but not least.
Well, first I would ask that person what they think about libraries that is becoming obsolete. For academic libraries, I would argue that we play a crucial role in guiding people through the search and evaluation process to find a healthy group of resources for a project or for an idea. For public libraries, I would take the digital divide argument because, you know, even though we are all very connected in this world, there are still a lot of us that are unconnected, and particularly with the economic state of the country, I think libraries are more important than ever because it helps bridge that digital divide.
All right, thanks, Nikki. And I forgot in my introduction to put in my Twitter plug, but our hashtag today is AL Live. And I wanted to mention we're getting a lot of positive reactions to the various metaphors everybody heard in your elevator speeches. And it looks, Joanna, it looks like your fire hose metaphor was particularly popular. So
it's not original.
Yeah, I think that's going to be pretty widely circulated on Twitter. But someone in the audience made a really good point. I think it was John. John said proper collaboration with advanced search capabilities makes Google a very helpful partner with libraries. And I'm really glad that you said that, John, because that kind of leads us into our next discussion point. There's been sort of a buzz, not a buzzword, a buzz phrase, I guess, where people talk about the idea of Google versus libraries. And we hear this both within and outside of library communities, as if there's this idea that Google is competing with libraries, Google is making libraries obsolete, you know, implying somehow that the popularity of Google is a death knell for librarians. And the first thing I want to ask, is that notion even correct? And if you think it's correct or you think it's not, let me know why or why not. And Nikki, since you were last time, why don't we start with you this time?
Okay, well, I don't think that Google is a death knell for librarians. I think that, in fact, we are sort of supplementing, and they are supplementing what it is that each of us can provide. By that, what I really mean is, with the amount of information out there, and with the variety of opinions getting, you know, filtered to the extreme of our own personalized viewpoint. Anyway, I think that librarians and the library itself is essential because it provides a context for all of the stuff that's floating around online. The librarians will help show us how to navigate that flow of information in a way that we might otherwise not know how.
Okay. John, let's move on to you.
Yeah, I'd actually probably amplify Nikki's statements that there are, first of all, I do think the Google versus libraries dichotomy, as I said, is probably false. There is a danger of some of the traditional roles of libraries being abdicated to some of these online presences, the finding role when it comes to Google, or I think the evaluation and the recommendation role of libraries in a lot of cases has been ceded to Amazon or Goodreads or those places. So I think it's worth looking at, but again, I come back to the idea that there's no reason that a user who starts out on Google can't end up at the library. And for me, that's the big opportunity of the future, is putting libraries out on the open web and the search engines, not somehow trying to fight the reality that that's where users are starting.
Okay, Beth, your thoughts?
I agree that it's a false dichotomy. I mean, Google is a tool. It has replaced some functions of libraries, and those are the kinds of questions where there's a single right answer. I mean, I'm old enough that I remember when you had to call the post office or visit a library if you wanted something like a zip code or, God forbid, a corporate address. But those things are easy to get with Google nowadays. But most information problems that people face are much more complex than that. It's not an easy, simple, straightforward question with one single answer, and that's where libraries are so valuable.
Okay, and Joanna, your thoughts?
I think that Google is probably providing us with a lot of job security. The students who use it use the single search box and they type in whatever they think is going to work, and they take whatever they get. And I think we can act as teachers to help them get better results by showing them how to do a better search to get after what they're looking for.
And someone, Jerry in the chat space, quoted Neil Gaiman, Google can bring you back 100,000 answers, but a librarian can bring you back So I think that's where we're going. But I think if Google isn't our enemy, if Google is part of the library picture, let's talk a little more about that. Let's talk with how Google can be, maybe a partner isn't the right word, but how Google can be one tool in our arsenal as librarians. John, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and I actually do think that Google can be leveraged just the way other starting points out on the web can be leveraged. OCLC has some success with doing that already, not so much with the search engine optimization, but with our syndication program, where right now when a user is looking at a title on Google Books or a specific title via the ISBN on Wikipedia, there's a find in a library link that's provided on that title level display, which will take the user back to the cooperative's collection and the holdings at all the different libraries. So we've had some initial success with sort of throwing the net out to the open web and pulling users back in to library collections, which is ultimately what they want to use. The next frontier is working with the search engine specifically and trying to get that search engine optimization, where the dream would certainly be that if a user types in a search for a title and they're on your campus or near your public library, your local collection comes up along with Amazon and Goodreads and all these other aggregates. That future is not here yet, but I think that's another great way that we just use Google as a place to get more usage driven back to the library.
Okay, Joanna, over to you.
Yeah, I think Google is a good, or can be a good discovery tool. They don't have to necessarily start at the library catalog to find out what we own and how to get it. So I think in that sense, the more that we push our information out to where it's discoverable on Google, the better it is for the people who actually need the information.
And we've got a good comment from Dave in the chat space. Dave says, any librarian who doesn't use Google is missing out on the single best information tool in human history, but any librarian who only uses Google is missing out on the rest. So I think that puts it in context pretty effectively. Beth, what do you think?
Yes, I agree with that. And from an instruction standpoint, I think that Google is invaluable because our students come to us with experience using Google that can be a foundation for teaching them how to use more sophisticated tools and for teaching them how to think about information. But we have to start there. We have to start with what they know and not just automatically dismiss Google as some sort of, the reality is everybody uses Google. We use Google when we're starting, when we're looking for information, and so I think we sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot if we paint it as this kind of horrible thing.
Nikki, your feelings on that?
I think back to the assumption that all of the stuff that people find on Google is supposedly bad. I just started reading a book called The Information Diet by Clay Johnson, and he said that blaming a medium, in this case Google, or its creators, for changing our minds and habits is like blaming food for making us fat. It really comes down to librarians educating people on good search habits and knowing that because our searches can be so personalized, how to sort of how to expand our horizons and our thoughts, and how we might approach finding alternative viewpoints. So I think that Google is a great starting point, but I also think that there are plenty of other options as well, including in any kind of library, in academic libraries, public libraries. I know we have a wide variety of audience members here, and I'm at an academic library, but I can see that all of this stuff extends beyond just the instruction element towards showing people how to use Google in a way that actually is they could customize it, the way that Google has kind of been customized for them already based on their own search habits.
Someone Kelly made an interesting point in the chat space. I just want to get anybody and everybody's thoughts on this. She said so much of what we're talking about regarding Google could also apply to Wikipedia, which I think is an interesting point, because Wikipedia is for many people a starting point for doing research, and it's not a bad starting point. It's just generally not great when you use it exclusively as your research tool. So let me just throw out this open question. Does anyone agree, disagree, or have any strong feelings on that comment?
I agree with that entirely. I use it as a starting point all the time, but people have to know that that can't be your only source. It's just like any other source of information. You want to verify and check and double check to make sure that what you're getting is accurate and reliable information.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I agree with. Oh, I'm sorry, John.
No problem. I actually, from my perspective, Wikipedia is a lot more dangerous to library usage than the search engines are. I'm very optimistic that libraries can be represented out in the search engines and that their users can find their way to them, because the search engines are really just there to take a user with a need and get them to an information resource that meets that need, and libraries are such a resource. Wikipedia, I think a lot of users and students confuse it with the end point of a search. They don't see it as a starting point, and that's where the danger lies.
That's an interesting point, and I'm just curious to see if anyone on Twitter or in the chat space has a response to that. The idea that Wikipedia is more of a danger than Google to librarians, but I certainly think we've seen that some students and patrons will over-rely on it, especially if you're doing something like a paper or trying to do professional research. You don't want to go to Wikipedia. We've talked a bit about the idea of libraries getting their information on Google, and I want to see if we can expand on that. And Nikki, I want to start with you. I mean, so let's get a little more specific. Librarians getting their information to Google and search engines. What do librarians need to be doing to make sure that's happening? What's kind of the 101 there?
For libraries to get our information to search engines. Are you speaking in a search engine optimization sort of a way?
Both in an optimization way and just in the sense of having it there. It's making sure if we want people to start on Google and end up at the library, how do we get them from point A to point B? Okay, well, I think that we have to know how the search engines function in order to incorporate that into our site design as libraries, and we need to know our content and our audience, and we need to design that for our users. I think that it's easy to forget that, in this case for search engine optimization, I think it's easy to forget that it's ultimately about making our content visible to Google users and in the most effective way for the users. Oftentimes I think that some people mistake the idea of making our content visible with a sort of a shadiness to it, like an inauthenticity, because we're focused on how we can sort of play a role in manipulating the results in our favor. And I think that's something that shouldn't be shied away from, because people have similar ideas about search engine optimization with assessment. I was just reading about that yesterday. People tend to think assessment's shady, and really it could be used in the organization's favor in the same way that something like this could be used in the library's favor if we look at it from the right standpoint. Okay. John, what about you?
So in terms of how libraries can better work with the search engines and the open web, so I don't want to go too deep into technical weeds, but I think this is a place where linked data is really creating an awful lot of possibilities for us.
And that actually, since you're going to talk about that, John, I'm not cutting you off here, but I just want to bring in an audience question that's relevant as well. Because someone, regarding your last comment, somebody said in the chat space, how is the future that John mentions going to be realized? Through linked data, how can we leverage the consumer-driven model and help vendors get up to speed? So I want to bring in that question in case that helps inform your answer.
It does. So what's the how of getting to a future where, again, a library types or a user types in Pride and Prejudice into Google, and there's your library if they're local. The facilitating technology right now, it looks like linked data. We've done a lot of work with linked data, and we're currently exposing WorldCat through schema.org. And schema.org is just the syntax that is used by retailers, really, to offer their inventories to the search engines. It's really function designed to be consumed by search engines, and it's function designed to expose inventory. So when I search for a USB cable and Best Buy comes up in my Google results and tells me the one down the street from me has 3 on the shelf, that's using schema.org. We felt that that role mapped very nicely to this possible hoped-for future where someone does a search for the book and, hey, there's 2 copies on the shelf on campus and there's 3 more down the street at the public library. Having the technology that the search engines consume is just the first step, and that's the step we've taken. They then need to sort of pay attention, right? I think it's one thing to just expose the data in a way that they can consume it, and you will see a bump in libraries and search engines if that happens, and that is happening. But I think my sort of personal dream, which is a little bit farther out, is having that specialized search engine display, again, that you see with the movie theaters, right, where those real-time movie times that are local, which is really the inventory of the shows, that shows up in a very specialized way, and it's leveraging what Google knows about the individual to show what's local to them. That would take a lot more negotiation with the search engines themselves. You don't sort of get it for free by exposing the content, but I think it's conceivable. Again, I think our existing syndication program shows that the large web players will pay attention to libraries if they advocate through one voice, for example, through the cooperative.
Okay. Beth, I want to come back to you on this and ask if you have any thoughts.
Well, again, I think that Google and even I'd go so far as to say Wikipedia have a lot to offer in terms of our patrons' familiarity with those tools and using that as a basis for them to understand what we have to offer, to compare and contrast what we have to offer, particularly contrast, not in a negative or positive way, but just for them to understand the purposes of different types of information. And quite frankly, how they use something or when it's appropriate to use something varies according to what their information need is at the time. I mean, there's a lot of low-stakes questions where a sloppy web search will deliver an adequate answer, but when you're in a different context, like an academic context where you're learning a new language and participating in scholarly dialogue, well then some of the tools that you may be used to be using in casual life are no longer appropriate. And so again, it comes back to context, and that the whole thing is actually just a lot more complex than the dichotomy that John's described a couple of times.
Joanna, your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking about, I guess, linked data. I'm thinking specifically about all those unique collections in libraries and other places that normally you would have to go and visit. And having those things available in digital format and having them discoverable on something like Google really enriches everything that we can do online and allows a lot more to happen worldwide because everybody can get there.
I want to ask a question for our academic libraries because we got a question that came in on Twitter, so this is just sort of a quick response question here. But someone asked, do you really think there are students who view Google as the start and end point for their research? So just a quick roundtable, quick answer. Have you experienced that or not?
I know that I have. It depends on their major. Sometimes how often they use the library is also based on their major, but yes, I have seen that.
Beth?
Yes, I have seen that as well. And they do find academic articles, scholarly articles or things that they can use out there. I think it's possible to do. Is their work as high of quality as it would be if they were using library sources? No. Also, are they expending a ton of energy that to piece together something using a source that's not quite suited for their purpose? Yes, they're expending a lot more energy than they need to if they were familiar with the tools that are at their disposal through their library.
And Joanna, I'm curious to hear your perspective because you serve patrons and you also teach library science students as well. So
right.
In that dual role, what's been your experience?
Not necessarily my library school students, but my students who at a lower level are taking information literacy. Every semester I come across people who didn't know there was anything other than Google. And so they had no idea that there was anything else they could do. So yes, indeed.
Do you feel like your library science students come in sort of over Googleized?
Mm-hmm.
I think probably most students do, because that's the first place they go. And they don't always continue on from there.
That's interesting. Well, we are almost halfway through, and we're still talking about Google. So let's get back to our title and go beyond Google. We've talked a lot about Google, but we've talked about it in the context of libraries having a lot more to offer and a lot of other ways to provide information. And when we were having our preliminary talk among the panel here, one thing we talked about was the idea, I think this has been alluded to briefly, but the idea of the information junk food diet and how we can help people get beyond that. So I want to talk a little bit about what are these things that librarians do that are different from Google, better than Google, can enhance Google. So John, why don't we start with you, and why don't we start? I think you were the one who brought it up in our preliminary conversation. Why don't we define this concept first of the information junk food diet?
I'm not sure that was me, but I'm certainly happy to weigh in. So if the real question is what do libraries do better than Google or the search engines, I think those are legion. It starts at the nuts and bolts level with the quality of the metadata. I actually think when libraries do things that the search engines do, even down to searching, the searching is much more powerful and specialized because of how great the descriptive metadata is. And that's something that catalogers in particular in the profession have built over time. You then have the roles that have been alluded to in this conversation, the guiding role, the mentoring role, the instructional role that you don't get from a piece of software. And I think although the casual user, the person who's using the library as an errand, may not benefit from that, there are those critical users who need the deep dive, and at that point, that's where the Neil Gaiman quote becomes germane, where someone needs to be taken by the hand and they need to go deep, and that's where a piece of software can't get all the way there.
Okay. Beth?
Yes, I think we know that searching for information, particularly to solve a complex research problem, like writing a research paper or something like that, it's an affective process. I mean, people go through a lot of emotional stages. It's very well studied and documented in the literature. So I think one of the things that we offer at libraries are a human face and support. We have gotten so used to, as a society, the idea that to get the answers to our questions, we can type a few words in a search box and hit enter and get some results, and that's the only way to do it. But that isn't true. There's so many other aspects and ways to approach things that librarians can guide users to. One of the first being is to step back and think out your information need before you just jump in for instant results, because that's a big time waster too if you really haven't explored and have a good understanding of what it is that you're after. And that's the human side of librarianship.
Andrew Pace is in our chat space. I just want to bring in a funny comment he made. Andrew says, my son says that Google is for old people. He starts all his searches on YouTube. So maybe we're already behind in having. Okay. Nikki, let's move on to you.
Well, I just learned about some work done by Danai Kotra, I hope I'm saying it right, of Carnegie Mellon, and two Microsoft researchers who set out to identify and study information-seeking behavior and access to alternative versus reinforcing viewpoints following shocking, emotional, large-scale news events. In this case, they took the example of the Newtown shooting, and they wanted to analyze search and browsing gun control on the issue before it happened and after. And what they found was that when they found that people have a tendency to continue to access more extreme agreeable content after the event. And I feel like, in a way, that when an external event threatens a user directly, they'll explore content outside of the filter bubble. One of the things that really got me interested in this whole information diet concept in the first place, and it's been an interest of mine for a couple of years now, is Eli Parizer's talk, which is now really famous on TED, which was done a few years back, but still really relevant. And I think that plays such a major role in how librarians help shift the conversation of how we approach our access to information, whether it's in the classroom or just during a reference consultation. These authors suggested that interventional studies are devised, such as exploring how ranking and presentation procedures might raise the likelihood that users are exposed to a greater diversity of viewpoints, even if they don't deliberately seek out those perspectives. And not only does our role as librarians have a direct part in that, but I wonder if some of the stuff that John was talking about earlier might eventually in the future lead to some of this happening.
Okay. Joanna, your thoughts on this?
I think one of the best things, I guess this goes back to what Beth was saying, we provide a human face, and if someone can't find what they're looking for on Google, they can ask us a question. You can't really ask Google why the search isn't working. Mm-hmm. So we can provide some expertise with search concepts and techniques to make it more likely that those people will get the information that they're looking for. I think we can also guide them somewhat to get maybe opposing viewpoints or more reliable viewpoints than they might otherwise be able to get, just because it's difficult to sort through what kind of a site you're on and where the information is coming from and how that might lead to bias or whatever. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good place to shift to another aspect we wanted to talk about, which was, one of the big advantages of using a library. Google's information is democratized, which, when you just say it that way, that sounds pretty good. But when it comes to looking for things with a high amount of authority, maybe that's not so good. So why don't we get into that a little bit? I mean, the idea that the library is an objective arbiter of information. John, why don't we start with you there?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great point that Google is to some extent democratized, as you say, and that's particularly realized through how they rank things, which is through linking and usage. So they're really following the wisdom of the crowd as their default, which libraries, while they are extremely open to all viewpoints, when it comes to actual knowledge or research, they do acknowledge that democracy only goes so far, and at some point, I think it was Asimov who said, democracy doesn't mean your ignorance is the equivalent of my knowledge. At some point, libraries have to point to authorized sources, to peer-reviewed journals, to all that stuff that actually makes the bedrock of good research. So I think that is part of the role that we've talked about libraries playing, not being an even playing field to the point of ridiculousness. I'd also say that Google, while their baseline is that very democratic linking and usage-based relevance and so forth, they are also a for-fee company, and they certainly have sponsored ads and that kind of thing, and that's also a role that the library gets to be very pure in, and I think it's a strength of the library brand that folks know that they're not for sale in any way.
Nikki, your thoughts?
Well, I think that there's a difference between what I call regular Google and Google Scholar, and I feel like one of the things that I sometimes view Google Scholar as sort of a bridge between the library and regular Google. But one of the things that neither Google or Google Scholar does very well is address the vocabulary of a discipline, which is particularly important for more advanced research projects or developing those ideas. As students progress in their major, the likelihood that they'll need to start using their discipline vocabulary rises, and so that's definitely a concern of mine when I sort of decide whether I'm going to start or end at Google with a particular patron.
I want to bring in a comment from the audience, and Joanna, I want to go to you first on this. Somebody made a really good point here with all this conversation about Google databases, metadata. That's fine, but what about the reference interview? Isn't that really the starting point when we're talking to someone? I think the question that was asked in the chat space was, what about how does the reference interview affect this? And I think, Joanna, you were the one who brought up the idea of us, that people sometimes just want a human face to their information. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But so why don't we start with you there? What about something completely, totally non-technical, talking to someone in person, which, believe it or not, people still do.
Yeah, people still do that, and I think it answers a real need, especially in terms of limiting or being very specific and focused about what it actually is that you want to know. People start out with an idea or a question, but they may not ask it in a way that's going to give them what they need, or maybe they're not really looking for what they're asking for. They're looking for something else. So the reference interview is a way of getting hold of exactly what the person wants to get, which obviously facilitates the search after that.
You can sometimes clear up some, really simple things. Sometimes it's just a matter of a lack of understanding. Perhaps they're mistaking the term peer review for book review, and what they're really looking, you have to sort out, are you looking for peer-reviewed resources, or are you looking for book reviews? And it's a simple conversation can go a long way, and you're not going to have that conversation with your computer search engine.
That's right. I was just having a conversation with a colleague about this yesterday, because we constantly have this issue. Probably in most workplaces where we're so used to email, we're so dependent on email that I often find myself emailing someone who's sitting right across the hall from me when I could just stand. And it turns into a 10 email exchange, because sometimes when you're just relying on text, the context, things can be misinterpreted. Whereas if you just go talk to someone, you might be able to understand more clearly. You might be able to read between the lines. Like you said, Beth, you might understand if the thing they're looking for isn't exactly expressed in the words they're using, that kind of thing. So I just think that's so important to keep in mind. So I lost the name of the person who brought that up in the chat space, but I just want to thank them, because that was a fantastic point. And that's not something we were planning on discussing, but I think it's something we should be discussing. So I'm glad we are. Nikki, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I sort of agree with everybody else. One of the things that I think also kind of rings true in this conversation is the fact that when I'm helping somebody on chat in a reference, oftentimes when the question gets really complex, or I know they're really just out there in left field, then I just say, do you want to just call me and we can talk about it? Because face-to-face and actually talking to somebody, just even the inflection of the voice plays such a major part in helping us figure out what it is that they're actually looking for, and maybe where they don't really know where they're stuck, but they know they can't find the answer, so they're kind of asking us. So yeah, I think that the reference interactions are extremely important. And they are, going back to the whole idea of how it affects where we search with a patron. I think that the reference interaction is key because that will allow us to show them some of the attributes of Google and how it does interface with whatever library resources we do have.
Mm-hmm. And John, I know you don't work with patrons, but you work with a lot of librarians, so I want to give you a chance to give your input on this conversation as well.
I was almost hoping you'd miss me on this because I've spent most of my career designing the patron-facing search interfaces, which, as has been pointed out, in a lot of cases supplant for better or for worse the interaction with the human librarian, and certainly we considered ourselves when we were building search interfaces to be building to some extent an online reference interview, but there's no replacement, right? You'd have to be in the realms of artificial intelligence before you could have an automated librarian, and I don't think that's anywhere on the horizon. I think it's a critical value that people have, whether they're on the chat, on the phone, or in person. So I don't think that's a failure of the software efforts. I just think it's a reality.
I think so too. And I want to shift to the authority issue, because that's something that's coming up a lot in the audience questions. That's something we planned on talking about. And maybe I'll lead into this with an audience question, because I think this brings in some potential controversy, so it's a good question to ask. So someone asked, if there is no such thing as authority anymore, like if anyone can post something and get it found on Google or Wikipedia, what do you use as an authoritative source? Lots of newspapers are viewed as valid sources, but many are moving towards more of a user-generated content / crowdsourcing model for their news. Has anyone else noticed this, and what are your thoughts? Joanna, why don't we start with you there? And I think the first thing is, do we agree with that notion that there's no such thing as authority anymore?
Not entirely, no. It's true that you can put out whatever you're interested in putting out, and you can present yourself as an authority, but I think we try really hard to teach students to look for some clues about someone's authority in terms of their education, in terms of their work experience, in terms of the discipline in which they work, and I think if you concentrate on those kinds of things in kind of a package, you can weed out those authoritative pieces of information from those that are just opinion kinds of things that are contributed by people who may not have the background to be authorities.
Okay, Beth?
Is there such a thing as authority anymore? This might be a little bit off topic, but I mean, I think there clearly is such a thing as authority. I mean, I think people experience this. I experience it all the time on Facebook, where just folks, even very intelligent people that I know, will just see some meme that says something that sounds cool, and then they'll just share it with everyone without checking their facts. And even though when we're dealing with more complex problems, that whether what the truth is more complex, there is such a thing as facts that are right or wrong or true or not true. And some of the things, for example, the Facebook privacy things people post all of the time. Go, you need to do this and this and this to your settings, or else this is going to happen. And the reality is it's not true, and that if people read it and they believe it's true, they're going to spend a lot of time trying to set their settings up in Facebook to no end. There's no reason to do that. So simple fact checking is really important, and I think people can understand that, or should understand that, I hope, and that there's value in checking to see whether something is true or not true before you just contribute to an urban legend.
John, I'm curious to hear your perspective as someone who's worked to design software.
Sure. So I would probably, first of all, draw a distinction between two types of authority. There's the authority of the author, or say the group of scientists generating an article, and then there's a second level of authority, which is editorial authority, where someone comes across an article in a specific journal and that immediately confers a certain baseline level of legitimacy through their editorial policies, through their review. So you really have those two levels. I think the authority of the author or the creator of the content kind of hangs on a little bit in this new world, but what dissolves to some extent is the editorial authority. Right, in the same way that iTunes dissolved the album into component songs, and Discovery Systems really dissolved the journal in favor of the component articles. I think for a lot of users, we lose that editorial brand that can be a shorthand for the authorized sources in their discipline. And once again, I think it's libraries, not a comparatively flat broad discovery experience like Google, who need to indicate to them that the terrain is not level.
Okay. And Nikki, your thoughts?
Well, I think that authority has become very, it's dissolved quite a bit, but I don't think it's disappeared. I think that, I'll go off what John said, which was a really good point about editorial authority versus authority of the original author. One of the things that I see is, even I have to be careful of it myself. We all have our social causes that we're interested in. And when I see something on Facebook, kind of like what Beth said, you see these things, and if it's for a cause that you really believe in, sometimes, I'll post it without realizing, wait a minute, where did that come from? Who's the little link on the top that this comes from? And I think one of the things that happens now with information being so put out there in such a variety of ways, particularly with social media, is we forget who are the editors, and we forget to either even consider whether something is out of context, because at a quick blink, which is what we've become accustomed to do, is just be impatient and, oh, that looks good, let me put that there. We don't even think to consider sometimes whether something has been taken out of context. So I think the average user who's not always thinking about information and where it comes from could, oftentimes get themselves into trouble not realizing that. So yes, I do think that authority exists, but it's morphed into something a lot more complex than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. And how, in practical ways, how do we mitigate that? How do we deal with that as librarians? Why don't we start with you there, Joanna?
Well, again, I think just as Nikki said, or maybe it was Beth said, you have to check your facts. You have to know who your source is and what authority they have to make whatever statement they're making. So I like to tell my students that if they were to rely on me, I could put up anything I wanted about how to do open heart surgery. But if they were to rely on me to have that surgery done, they would not survive it. So I am an authority in some areas, but open heart surgery is not one of them. Mm-hmm. So you want to know where your information is coming from and who's giving it to you.
Okay, Beth?
Well, I think also what I do when I want to know if something's true or right, like say find a quote and who said a quote, I'm looking oftentimes to verify that from multiple sources. I think that, is it replicable, the answer to this question? If, the more, I think that if you can find it in several different sources, then that makes it more believable than if you can't verify it in sources. I mean, that's a rather simple way to look at it. But it is a step that that everybody should take when they're considering their use of information. What is the definition of a fact? Well, a definition of a fact would be that you would be able to find that same piece of information from multiple sources and from multiple perspectives.
Well, I want to shift gears because we've been getting a lot of questions about this. So before we finish today's broadcast, to some extent, it seems like our audience has really enjoyed our conversation, but to some extent, of course, we are talking to a library audience. So we don't really need to justify, that libraries are still necessary. We've been preaching to the choir a bit there. But one question that has come up quite a bit is, okay, we all know, that we're necessary and that we're vital. How do we get the message out about this? So let me just start by getting your quick thoughts on that. Just for you, Nikki, Joanna, and Beth, in your libraries, what do you do? How do you help justify how important you are? And how do you get that message out to students? Nikki, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm really excited about this question because I need ideas, as we all do. So for me, one of the things that I found is we are really steeped in relationships here throughout the university. So for us, one of the best ways is to work with our subject liaisons, which we have a subject liaison model, translates to our information literacy program. Really form some solid relationships with them. Also, one of the things that I have found is collaboration is such a key thing, and I know it's much easier said than done, but one of the ways that I found that really works for us here is to kind of collaborate on take a topic that's of interest to the university. Let's say financial literacy. That was sort of a buzzword earlier this afternoon here. And what can we do to help employees and students, everybody involved in the university, reach them at their level for that? I think that one of the things that the public libraries really have they do a great job of doing is community building. And I think that we could learn a lot from public libraries in terms of how they approach community building, but at an academic level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Beth?
I agree with that. I think it's not, as far as I know, and at least in my experience, programming isn't a very large part of an academic library's mission in a lot of cases, and we could certainly do a lot more of it. And bringing people, offering programs that people are interested in and bringing them into the library. Another thing is just has to do with, I think we understand as a profession that there are certain stereotypes that are associated with libraries and with librarians. So every interaction we have is really important in terms of customer service, in terms of being authentic, in terms of establishing those relationships, which I agree are key and play back into that human element that we've been talking about today. When people come in and they have a good experience, then that experience gets spread to other people, and gradually a reputation is built, and those stereotypes are lived down.
Mm-hmm. And John, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation either, because this is important to you as well.
It is, that I guess the only thing that I could say from my perspective, sort of one step removed from the user, is one of the things that we have tried to focus on as we've developed applications for users is don't just serve user needs, serve user expectations. Because then they'll be successful, and then they'll be comfortable, and then they'll keep coming back. We want it to be successful when they come into us, but we also want to, frankly, do what business does and set them up for the next visit as well.
Mm-hmm. And Joanna, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's kind of imperative for all of us to be out there and be cheerleaders for our libraries. We need to talk to people. We need to be involved in the political process that funds libraries. We need to be good citizens. We need to be friends with people across campus or throughout the community. We need to be involved. We need to advertise, so that people see the face of the library up front as opposed to seeing it as something in the background.
Well, I think it's just one more responsibility. This is a pretty common phenomenon now that librarians are having to do multiple things, some of which weren't part of their job description. So that may just be one more. I mean, we hear a lot that there are people, with budget cuts and staff cuts. People who are reference librarians are doing cataloging now. People who are catalogers are doing reference work now. So maybe we can just add that to the list. But someone did make a really good point in the discussion, and I don't think they were just referring to our conversation. I think they were making a general point. But they said when people talk about libraries being better than search engines in the conversation, I'm quoting whoever put this in the chat space, I see lots of turf defense, but not much real evidence that we're all that much better. I mean real evidence. So let's talk about that a little bit. Where's the real evidence and how can we present that? Beth, why don't we start with you?
Well, there is some evidence emerging. For example, a body of studies that are associating academic library services with greater student retention and success rates in colleges. So there's that type of evidence, if that's the kind of evidence that he's referring to. But those of us that work on the public services side with patrons every day see this kind of evidence time and time again when we know that we've helped somebody. And we do receive a lot of gratitude for that help, and I can't ignore that kind of evidence when you know that you're making a difference in students' lives, many of whom may be coming from non-traditional backgrounds. I think that's the pivotal role that academic libraries play, is in being able to help the non-traditional student ease into academic life and be successful, both with academic life and in their profession into the future. It's a life changer.
So it sounds like what you're saying is maybe the evidence that we have, we need to find better way. It's not. We need to find better ways where we can quantify that evidence and make it more tangible, because we know what it is, we know it's there, but it's what you just said is it makes sense to librarians, but that's not something you can put in a chart.
Right.
So maybe we need to find more effective ways to do that.
Well, and Megan Oakleaf has some excellent materials on that, and some grids and charts that can be produced that tie your library's activities to institutional goals and that type of thing. So it is possible to be done, and we're just starting as a profession to go down that road, and it's a great road for us to be going down.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, your thoughts?
Well, I'm not exactly sure the best way to quantify that, other than maybe a survey asking about user satisfaction and how they would rate our performance. But if you go back to the human side of things, I know my libraries have never been busier. People are wanting to be there, and they're using the services that we offer. And as budgets get cut and the people on the wrong side of the digital divide have more need for libraries, that's where they come. We've had a terrible unemployment problem in Rhode Island, and those people who are unemployed frequently go to the library to use the resources there to look for jobs. That's just one example of how people use the library, but how you might quantify that, I'm not entirely sure.
Mm-hmm. Nikki?
Well, I really like that idea of having us quantify this, because we do a lot of turf defense. One of the pieces of evidence that I can come up with is the Project Information Literacy Studies. Again, I think that's almost all academic libraries, unless I'm mistaken, but they do a lot of work on looking at how much students gather in terms of their search and evaluation skills and how they approach information retrieval and searching for it and even just thinking about it upon entry into the workforce. And I think that's really our key piece of evidence that we need to start looking at is how does what they learn in their 18 to 24 college years, how does that translate into the workforce, and how does that make them better employees in terms of thinking about the information that they're given in their daily lives? I think that's really the best way to quantify this, but I have no idea how. I think that we would have to really go into some long-term studies with employers and relate that back to the universities that people came from. This is a huge project, and I wouldn't even really know how to get started, but I think it would be a good thing to find out.
All right, and with 1 minute left, John, I want to give you our final thought because I don't want you to be shut out.
Thanks. On this topic or in general?
Either one, your choice.
Sure. Well, I guess my parting thought would be to, I think the main theme has been the idea of erasing the perceived dichotomy between these new online tools, these places where the users are, and the service that the library has. I sort of think if we use these tools, if we be in these places, there's no replacement for the value that the library provides to a user search experience. There's no online equivalent to those collections and that mentoring. So I think it's probably important, and this was the last comment, not to be defensive and turfy, but to embrace Google as the way that's going to funnel your library's user to your library collection, and we'll just figure out the best way to make that happen.
I think that's a great way to close. So we want to thank our fantastic panel today. Beth, Joanna, Nikki, and John, thank you all so much. We want to thank our audience. Our audience was extremely active. We only got to a tiny fraction of the questions that got asked today, which is great. And I hope it was a valuable discussion for everybody. We want to thank OCLC for their sponsorship. Again, we want to thank the library at Northwestern University for their technical assistance. Thanks, everybody. We hope you have a great day, and we hope we see you at our next episode in July. Bye, everyone.